My name is Estelle, and I'm also known as Standardista Online. And the slides are going to be up on my GitHub, so you can just go to that link. I already posted it on Twitter. It should be up for close to forever or until GitHub folds, which I don't think it will. And I am kind of known for writing a few books because I have so much spare time. Currently, I am a tech writer, actually, at Mozilla, and I just started contracting there a few weeks ago, and I love my job because I got to document the web. So you've probably already hit it, but we also love when people contribute. So this talk, Fast, Simple, and Accessible, has been through many iterations. I originally wrote it as You Don't Need a Framework for That in 2011, when I used to come across this in many sites, which was pulling in a framework just to change a class or do something that could be done in CSS. Because this doesn't make it fast, it's not simple, and then you have to come back in and make things accessible. Then I rewrote the talk in 2015 when I worked at Visa, and they had 43 dependencies, because with 43 JavaScript dependencies, they had to put the performance back in and they had to put the accessibility back in. And then I rewrote the talk because I saw this code, which is using a span instead of a radio button. And this is actually part of Ember.js. And so I asked a bunch of people, how do you write, what does the name and value do on a radio input button? And every engineer I asked did not know actually how a radio button worked. And I thought, oh my God, I'm focusing on the wrong stuff. So this talk is about making sites fast and accessible, which is really just going back to the basics. So let's talk a little bit about accessibility. And Erie did such a good job on this. And so I was going to take it out, and then I'm like, you know what? Let's ram it into your brains and make sure that you have a full understanding of accessibility, because you might have not been listening fully, and it's so important. So this right here, if you look at the screen, it just says click here, click here, click here. If someone's using a screen reader and you don't think about the content of your page and you just put links around the clicks here's, that is what the screen reader will read out. And that is what the website will look like. This is what a poorly coded site looks like to a screen reader. And then we have this wonderful video here. Let me see if I can play it. How do you play these things? La, la, la. Okay, apparently it's not going to play. Let me just do this. Okay, it's not going to play. But it doesn't matter if it played anyway, because the audio is off, and this very funny joke is not really funny if you can't hear it. So let's go on to the next one. This is what a website might look like, or your colors might look like, to someone who has color blindness. There's many different types of color blindness, and I didn't actually think I was colorblind at all until I realized I couldn't really read the middle one and the upper part. So there's numbers in all of these, and about 10% of the audience in the room right there can't actually see what those numbers are. I can see 4 out of the 5. So color is important for color blindness. And Alistair wrote this tweet, which is completely true. We are all at some points disabled. Some people, we do think, just like Eric said, some people think of it as a dichotomy, a binary between 20/20 vision and completely blind. But disability is really a mismatch in the interaction between the features of where your body is right now, what your environment is in which you live. So if you are wearing stilettos and you are walking through a muddy field, you have a temporary disability. If you are trying to read look at your phone in the sun, you have a temporary disability. It's not that you are disabled, but there's a mismatch between what your physical space is, your environment, and what you are trying to do. So in the United States, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that made it so that they put curbs on every sidewalk. And most people thought that it was for wheelchairs. And the truth is, it is for wheelchairs, but it's also for the rest of us, whether you're riding a bicycle, a skateboard, pushing a tram, or what I use it for is pulling my suitcase as I travel around the world. I am so thankful that they put those curbs in. I'm not in a wheelchair, but I definitely make great use of that feature. So as Ari pointed out very well, that disability is a spectrum from a permanent disability to situational, with sometimes when you have temporary, when you're sick or when you broke an arm or something like that. So when we are fixing the websites and thinking about permanent disabilities, we're really also fixing it for situational and temporary disabilities. So back to the radio button and accessibility. Here is a field set with a legend. And it basically says accessibility is important, useful, helpful for everyone, the right thing to do, simple, or required, or is it all of the above? Because I've used radio buttons, instead of having to hit this tiny little circle, I can actually click on the word important, and that whole thing is selected because I wrap the whole thing in a label. So here, the answer is truly all of the above, but notice that when I clicked on all of the above, important was unchecked. This is using pure HTML. It does everything we want for us. It is accessible. It is super fast because there's no JavaScript, right? So HTML is by default fast, and it's by default accessible. And it's our job to not fuck that up. But when we do have to make things that aren't necessarily, like when we have to take HTML to a new level, we do have accessible rich internet applications, which is a way of adding accessibility to HTML and adding it to our JavaScript when we are removing the default accessibility. But the first rule of ARIA is if there is a native HTML element or attribute that you can use that semantic behavior that's built into HTML instead of using ARIA. You can sprinkle ARIA on top, but think about what your HTML elements do and how you can leverage all of their accessibility and all of their features instead of using divs or spans. Someone asked a question about an hour ago, why not use div, why not use spans? Because those radio buttons, I was able to click on a label which selected the radio button, which deselected another radio button. I didn't have to add any other features, and the screen reader is able to completely understand what I did. So the other quote is, HTML is by default accessible, and it's fast, so don't mess with it. Now I want to talk about performance a little bit. So Stephen Gundy tweeted, I remember when 3G was primary mobile speed. It was slow, but it still worked. So now when my phone says 3G, it becomes completely useless. In the United States, we tend to blame our service provider. In 2010, the average website was 70% of a meg. It was 702 kilobytes. In 2018, it is 3.5 megabytes. So our phones, it's not necessarily AT&T's fault or whatever your service provider is, that your website is now 5 times the size that it was 8 years ago. So we've been given prescriptions on how to make websites faster. Earlier today, Christopher Schmidt, Telecheck, spoke about image optimization, and he talked about the different media types and talked a lot about the sizes and as in the byte size. At the bottom, there's a link for essential image optimization. So I'll leave it at that, and you can look that up later. And then we also have video optimization. And I wrote a blog post on this because most people don't really think about video optimization. But there's 4 steps that you can do to optimize images, videos, which is number 1, don't include a video if you don't need to. If you do include a video, compress it as much as possible. With videos, you can optimize the source order. So you put different sources depending on the different media types. Put the smallest file size first, because when the HTML hits a media type that it can play, it'll play that one and it won't download the others. So actually, by optimizing the source order, you can make them play the smallest one that they can support. And one really obvious thing that very few people do is to remove the audio from muted heroes. So you'll have on the top of a screen, you'll have this video in the background playing, and it's actually pulling down an audio file. So I wrote a blog post on it, and it also gives instructions on how to remove that audio if you're not, if it's always muted. And then there's some tools that we can use for performance. YSlow, I included it because it was the first one, and so it really started the trend in terms of actually having performance tools. All of your browsers have panels, developer tools, where you can see performance. Web page test is awesome, and Lighthouse is actually my favorite. And Ari discussed it in terms of accessibility. You can do an audit and it will not just tell you about the accessibility, but it'll also tell you about the performance, whether you're using best practices, and if you want to test how many progressive web app features that you have, and it'll give you hints on how to improve. So definitely use these performance tools. So then we also have usability rules, such as configuring the viewport. And if you hover over these, there's instructions on how to do it. So these slides actually have information behind them. Just by configuring the viewport and sizing content to the viewport, you're making your site more usable and more accessible. So definitely do that, but also avoid plugins. Make sure that your tabs sizes are large enough, because people's thumbs are not as small as a mouse pointer. And use legible font sizes, especially for people like me that need to wear granny glasses now to read the web. I am I'm permanently disabled because I need to wear glasses. But when I have my glasses on, I can see better. So I guess it's temporary. WCAG has guidelines basically saying that you should make your content and your everything perceivable. Your UI perceivable, operable, understandable, and everything robust so that it works with all the different browsers or user agents, including assistive technologies. So there's a few tips that I have. One is user agent sniffing should never be assistive technology sniffing. People who are using screen readers do not want the world to know that they're using screen readers. It is the one place in their life where they don't have a disability, where no one can see, where no one sees them as different, where they completely fit in. So even if the browser vendors start allowing you to sniff assistive technology, don't ever do it. When I say use HTML instead of JavaScript, when you use JavaScript, realize that you need to manage the focus, and all of that has to be added with JavaScript. So use those browser defaults as much as possible. And remember that HTML is faster and accessible by default. When you include CSS, you can make it even more accessible, but you have to think about it. So keep it always in your mind. Keep accessibility and performance always in mind, and you can enhance performance and you can enhance accessibility. And realize that these two technologies are more accessible and much faster than JavaScript, because when you start including JavaScript, you have to actively put accessibility back in and performance back in, because JavaScript is slowing down. It's just adding bytes. And then you have to, if you're actually creating a web app with lots of JavaScript, you have to download it, you have to parse it, you have to execute it. And it does a lot of stuff behind the scenes. So you have reflows and repaints, and all of that takes time. Okay, so I was talking about the 3.5 megs rather of websites. So what does that contain? The videos have really increased, images have really increased, and scripts have really increased. So the biggest chunks coming down the pipe is video, images, and scripts. So the issues with this is, remember when I showed you that Visa site? It had 43 JavaScript dependencies. So it was 3/4 of a meg, but it was 1 meg, but 674 kilobytes were JavaScript. So that had to be downloaded, parsed, executed, and continually run. It was slow, and because everything was created with JavaScript, the accessibility features had to be put back in. So that site used React, Backbone, jQuery, Bootstrap, jQuery input masking, and many, many other things. For form, it is a form. This is the form. I rewrote this in one, like with 14 kilobytes of CSS, I could actually put it in one request with 2 background images, one for the logo and one for the background. What I call including 43 dependencies, I call that RDD, or resume-driven development, where the developers are actually just including a bunch of features because they want to include the features and play with the features, not because the site needs it. After all, this is a form with 3 inputs, your email address, your password, and a check mark, and that's it. So why did it need so much? Because they were using so many dependencies, they had code like this, which, if you look at this here, I'm going to remove the stuff that, highlight rather the stuff that you're kind of like, you have a WebKit keyframe when you don't actually need a WebKit prefix except for browsers that barely support animation, such as Android 2.3. That's where you need the WebKit prefix animation. But you will never need a Microsoft filter within a keyframe animation, because any Microsoft browser that understands keyframes that understands WebKit keyframe, if any do, will understand opacity. And you really are never going to hit an Internet Explorer if you have a WebKit prefix on the media query, basically. Or it's not a media query. Another thing to think about is images and JavaScript bytes are not equal. Images have to be downloaded, decoded, and rasterized and painted. JavaScript has to be downloaded, parsed, executed, rerun, garbage collection, etc. So when you're downloading an image, it's basically rendered and you're good to go. When you're downloading JavaScript, you might be able to shrink those bytes down to next to nothing using gzip and Brotli, but you're expanding it back up and you're running it and you're executing it. So just because the bytes are smaller than your images doesn't mean it's not using up the CPU much more than your images are. Doesn't mean that it's not going to crash the mobile device that you're trying to play on. So it's okay to use all those dependencies, but think of it as scaffolding when you're building a bridge. You would never open the bridge with the scaffolding still there. Think of the dependencies as scaffolding, something to help you quickly develop the site, but then pull it out. So let's just think about this site. This is my rendition of the site. It is fully functional, other than it doesn't submit because I don't have any place to submit it to. But it works, right? And it has a little carousel here that I can, for some reason my keyboard is not working right now, but normally I can just click on left and right with my keyboard and it will actually go left and right. My version loaded in 1 second, and that's because it's on GitHub. So I don't know how much of that was actually connected to GitHub. Whereas their version I'm afraid of actually going to the right. It takes 6 seconds to load. My slides are not working in this whole system right now. So just believe me when I say it takes, oh, here it goes. Here we go. And fully loaded at 6 seconds. And they're actually on a CDN. So what did I had those 3 features, and I'm going to show you how I created those 3 features and still made the site faster. My original JavaScript framework, and the reason I'm sharing this is, well, I'm going to tell you that you don't need to use a framework. My original JavaScript framework was in 2003 when I actually had to say, is DHTML supported? Basically, is JavaScript supported? If document get element by ID, because not all browsers could get element by ID. So I basically created this tiny little framework. Oops. And reload. Okay, I created this tiny little framework, sorry about that, that's 150 lines long to equalize all the browsers, to basically say all the browsers need to have these basic features. Now that we have evergreen browsers, we don't need those frameworks. All we need to do is think about what JavaScript, HTML, and CSS give us by default, and use those before we pull in a framework or a library or a plugin. Can we do something simply without adding all the fluff that we don't really need? So one of the things that is nicely supported in all browsers is the date time picker. So here, no JavaScript, I can pick, what is today's date? Today's date, oh, it's already highlighted for me. It's the 11th. It's still the 11th where you are. It's still the 11th in Australia, I think. Nope, they're already on the 12th. Okay, so we have all these features that are supported. We have these ranges, we have these check boxes, we have all these features. Use those. Everything is really well supported and by default accessible. And then add in, or always think about accessibility. So the best way to make something accessible, such as a form control, is to include a label. When you include the label, as you saw before, you can click on the label and it'll put focus into the input. So I clicked on the telephone number, which was a label, and it gave me focus onto this input. If you don't include the label, the screen reader will read the placeholder. If you don't include the placeholder, it will read the title. If you don't include the title, it is not accessible. You can also add ARIA sauce to it. You can add an ARIA label, which will be read by the screen reader instead of the label, or you can write ARIA labeled by, where you can select more than one element. So I could do ARIA labeled by label, give the ID of the label and give the ID of the hint. So this is the order that the screen reader will read. It will read first the ARIA labeled by. If that's not there, the ARIA label, or the placeholder, or the title. You have to have one of these. But the best idea is to just use HTML for what it was intended. And then when you're creating, if you are writing frameworks, like this is Ember, don't reinvent the wheel. Don't re-implement semantics, focus, and tab order. In this case, the outputted content was a div with a span that had a class of form label. So they had to associate it, and then they have an input with no name or value. It's just an input type radio. So they had to reinvent everything. And remember, radio buttons are by default accessible, useful, navigable, supported. If I go, sorry, I can't arrow up and down because I've actually usurped my up and down arrow to move my slide deck around. But basically, all of this works on its own. So if they had written, instead of writing this div class row, radio row with span class form label, if they had instead written label with a legend and the content, that would have been much more semantic, and the people who were implementing this would actually learn how HTML works. So the radio button was invented in 1993. It's been around for 25 years. And a radio button is for attributes which can take a single value from a set of alternatives. Each radio button in the group should be given the same name. That's how simple HTML is. So I actually used radio buttons to create this carousel. And of course, it's not going to work because it's in my deck. But when you have this open in its own page, when you hit the right arrow or the left arrow, let me see if I can actually, I'm not going to because I don't have the time. But when you hit the right arrow or the left arrow, or one of the radio buttons, or the up arrow or the down arrow, it actually goes through and the carousel, and the carousel works. So instead of doing what the Visa engineers did, which create a button with divs with rows of options and data carousel and maintaining the tab index and aria selected equals true, instead of doing all of that, I just created a field set with a legend and a label, and then created form controls with an ID and an ID and an ID and an ID. And it ended up being 1.1 kilobytes and just, oh, I don't know, 3 lines of script. This is the CSS. All it is a change of a transform. So transforms translates it by the width of the item. And the JavaScript just changes on change when it changes, set the attribute of class to a different class name. And that is how it works. So it's not that it's JavaScript free, but it's almost no JavaScript, just setting the class. So it has accessibility features of using appropriate semantics, labels, states are off and on and are distinguishable to the user. Keyboard access is supported, and focus state can be clearly visible if you're a better designer than I am. And it fits all of the requirements as required. So the thing is, here's just another example. I have a carousel of carousels. The thing is, I couldn't name it a carousel because when I created this thing, which just uses radio buttons to show content, it was so accessible that the people using screen readers said it's not a carousel because I can actually access all of the information. So I called it a merry-go-round, and you can create your own. So here's a repo if you want more information on it. Similarly, here's a list of select items, right? At Visa, they used a whole framework, and they did role option tab index 1, aria selected false, because they had to re-implement roles and maintain state with aria selected and maintain focus with tab index. What I did is I just created a legend with inputs and labels. And when someone clicks on that label, they're clicking that radio button and making it selected. Tiny bit of CSS to make it look good. Tiny bit of CSS to open up the footer by transforming it from 0 to 100. And the only thing that the JavaScript does is open and closes this footer from, changes the class from closed to not closed. So it gives it a height and transforms it or doesn't transform it. A third script that I did is here. In the United States, we have 5-digit zip codes. And a designer wanted masking, which is they wanted to have the placeholder still in state. So I changed this placeholder to pink. And it's not actually a placeholder. It's what I call input masking. My script is 2 kilobytes. It's actually 3 kilobytes now because I auto-initiated it. But it was instead of using the jQuery input mask, oops, sorry. Come on, let me reload this. Okay, demo here. Please work, okay. So they used a total of 60 kilobytes for my 2 kilobytes. So the way theirs works is similar. I have to increase the size and then you can't see it, so let's not even bother. But what I did is I basically used HTML. I used an input with a type of zip code gave it a placeholder, and then a pattern attribute, and with a pattern attribute, oh, and a title. So the pattern attribute says, I only want 5 digits. The placeholder says, here are the 5 places for the 5 digits. Then the JavaScript, what the JavaScript does is it takes the input, right, that has a class of shell, or masked rather. When I hover over it, it gets big and goes off the screen. But anything that has a class masked, it puts a shell around it. So it opens up with a span of class shell and then hides the mask above the actual input. So here you have your input. If the JavaScript doesn't work, this is still completely there on the page and accessible. And what it does is it creates a mask, and as the person enters it, the mask, the X's change over to the characters, and then the character that's in the I tag becomes transparent. So there's a GitHub repo for this, but basically I just made the input and the mask transparent, and that's all there is to it. So I'm using a little bit of CSS and a little bit of JS to add functionality, but I'm keeping the HTML semantic, and therefore it's accessible without me adding any ARIA. So just one note, which is sometimes CSS and semantic HTML isn't the right way. Like if you take a table and you display it to grid, you're actually removing the accessibility features of table. So sometimes CSS is actually detrimental to your semantic HTML. But if you actually think about this at all times, when you're thinking about accessibility and performance as you're developing, your site will be by default accessible. And there is a solution to this. Here's a code pen. Here's a table. And if you see the header stays static, and even the left column, which stays static. So this is using table semantics, and therefore it's still semantic. Okay, so to summarize, think outside the box and think about the box. The box is your HTML, but most people think their box is a JavaScript framework or a plugin or an added feature. If you think outside the box and think to originally what we're provided with, you can do a lot of these things without increasing your file size or without messing with accessibility. So use JavaScript as you need to, but don't use it as a crutch and get rid of your scaffolding. And when you really need to, there is ARIA to improve the accessibility of your features. But generally remember the first rule, which is if you can do it with semantic HTML, do it with semantic HTML. So here's a list of resources and the repos and some performance features. And just a reminder, please contribute. When you're enjoying MDN and you find a mistake, all you have to do is hit edit, and you can actually contribute. And that's it for my talk.
Thank you very much, Stu. So because our time is fast spent, just one question. Is there any,
okay.
Are there any questions?
Thank you for the teaching. It's awesome. Quickly, can you differentiate between add-ons, extensions, and plugins? Because I know Mozilla is one of the browsers with plugins, most plugins, if I will say.
So a plugin is something that's in the browser. So that doesn't really have much to do with the talk, because the talk is actually what, as a developer, you're shooting down as a website. So an extension is something that you would add to the browser. A plugin can either be added to the browser or to the website. So I'm not sure what your question has to do in terms of performance or accessibility.
Can I come again? I mean,
yes.
So I just want clarity on add-ons, plugins, and extensions, because in your teaching you mentioned we should avoid plugins and all that.
What I meant is plugins. So like if you're using, like in the United States, restaurant menus always have Adobe Acrobat menus. And so when someone clicks on a menu, they have to open up a plugin. So avoid those as much as possible, because you have to actually add in the features on some of them. You know, it depends how you create the PDF for your restaurant menu. But a lot of people will use Photoshop and then save it as a PDF, and then none of the content is accessible. Whereas if they created it in you know, like Word and saved it, then it would possibly be accessible, but it's still a PDF and they still have to open up that plugin. Whereas if they just saved it as an HTML file, then it would be by default accessible and they wouldn't have to open up the plugin, because when you have, you know, a .pdf or some other file, you're basically opening up a plugin within the browser.
Okay.
So if you don't need to do that, don't do that. An extension, I didn't mean to use the word extension. An extension is a browser extension.
All right.
I don't know why I use that.
Okay, that's fine. And also you said by default, HTML is fast. CSS
Yes.
and JavaScript make it more scalable and I think perfect according to what you said. So what will you advise using rich medias like Flash and JavaScript? Because I know this will delve into some aspect of SEO. Some search engines like Bing, they find it difficult to crawl links and embedded content in JavaScript and CSS. So what will you say in this regard as to your browser, Mozilla?
I would say always use HTML if you can use HTML. An HTML link will be crawlable. If you have HTML, a link in your CSS, you're not doing the CSS right, because you should always, if something is content, you should leave it as content. You can rewrite, you know, like use a print style sheet to print the href attribute after a link. If you're printing, that will help someone who prints it onto a piece of paper to know later on where that link is going to, but they should not be putting the, you know, link text into generated content in your CSS. And then when you add in, so HTML fast, there's, you know, you're always, when you're using JavaScript to alter the DOM, you're still writing back to the DOM. So you're still creating these elements. So HTML is fast. If you needed to create 3,000 DOM nodes, probably iterating through writing the 3,000 DOM nodes in a virtual DOM and then presenting that to the screen might actually be faster. But if you need to download a full framework instead of just doing a simple loop, then that would probably be slower than downloading the bytes of the 3,000 DOM nodes. Do you see what I mean? Like, don't just stick in a JavaScript. Basically, the example of the masking, input masking, was, or the example of, actually, let me use the country selector. When you popped up from the bottom, the version that I did used almost no JavaScript. It used one line of JavaScript to change the class on the footer to open it and close it. The framework that Visa used was they had to import jQuery so that they could import a multi-select library or widget, I don't know what you want to call it. And that had so many features that you could actually type in the name of the country. So they used this library that was huge and did 10,000 things when all they really needed to do was have it select different countries. So instead of thinking about what they really needed and what were the limited features, they found this widget or this add-on that someone else created that did everything they wanted plus 10,000 other things. So they were downloading the JavaScript for the 10,000 other things when they didn't need it. So it's basically think about what you actually need for your website to function, and is what you're adding overkill? Do you really need to add all of these features, or can you actually just write that feature in 3 lines of script? And if you can write it in 3 lines of script, don't bother with the, like my blog has jQuery because WordPress has jQuery, and I never bothered to take it out. But I don't use any of the jQuery features except for like one thing that WordPress put in. So I don't need to have jQuery.
All right, thank
Right?
you.
So the idea is don't do the overkill. Think about what you need it for.